A few years ago, the lovely and I took our girls to Gatlinburg, Tennessee for spring break. It's been our favorite vacation spot. That Thursday, we went to a little theme park in the mountains called Ober-Gatlinburg. The girls really wanted to ice skate, so we paid for the wristband, laced up the skates, and took to the ice. For the first few times around, I looked like a newborn calf learning to walk, but I got the hang of it. Andrea and I stayed close to the wall to help the girls learn to skate. Soon, McKenna took off and was skating on her own. And by the time we left, Rayleigh was too, but she was only 7. A few times she wasn't so sure on her single-bladed shoes, so she reached for my hand or for Andrea's. But for the times she knew she needed help to stand, she reached for the handrail. It was fastened to the wall with huge bolts every few inches. Out on the ice, one guy was skating backwards like it was the Olympics. A few teens were falling. A few kids were barely walking. Some kids were crying. Some parents were crying because their kids were crying. It was chaos in the middle of the ice. No place for a 7-year-old learning how to skate. But as long as we could hold on to the handrail, we knew we could stay on our feet. This world is a chaotic place. Trials and tribulations test our faith. Temptations test our faithfulness. There may even be times we wonder if God hears us or if He can help us. For every one of those tough times when you think you're about to lose your faith footing, I invite you back to the handrail. It's the hope for all humanity. It's the empty tomb. Take a good long look at it. Jesus is not there anymore. He has risen just as He said. Good day to you, Simplify listener. You are listening to L.J. Harry, and you're listening to a brand new series on Simplify. Thank you for all of you who have faithfully walked with me through the devotional Simplify. The last 52 weeks have been a joy getting to walk with you as together we walk closer with Jesus. And we've already been through all 52 devotions in the devotional, but I want to continue sharing some devotions with you. Now, these next 8 will be a little different and a little longer because they're written for a different reason. They're not only written intended to encourage or inspire, but they are written to help us fight for what and whom we believe. For the next 8 weeks, I hope to help answer some tough questions people ask about God and about faith. And since we are celebrating Easter Sunday today, I want to answer the first tough question people ask about God. Is the resurrection really real? Well, let's ask her. She was the first one to see the empty tomb. Mary Magdalene came early that first Easter with an armload of spices and a heartload of grief, because the man she thought was Messiah just died on a cross 3 days ago. She hung her hopes on him being the hope of the world until the Romans hung him on a cross. Publicly humiliated and crucified as afternoon entertainment for a bloodthirsty mob whose only cry was crucify him. The soldiers waited the hours away until they could take his body down from the cross and go home. But they were pierced to the heart when they heard the man they just beat, mocked, pierced, tried, and crucified. Pray, Father, forgive them. Within just minutes, he cried, "It is finished," breathed his last, and died. Which brings us to our first argument against Jesus' resurrection. It's called the swoon theory. And it's not what happens when the most popular guy at youth camp walks into the sanctuary. It's the argument that Jesus didn't really rise from the grave because Jesus didn't really die on the cross. I believe it takes more faith to believe Jesus didn't actually die than to believe Jesus actually rose. The swoon theory suggests Jesus just swooned or fainted on the cross, but when they laid him in the tomb, the dark, crisp atmosphere of the tomb resuscitated him. Now, we don't have a 2,000-year-old medical examiner to read the autopsy, so we rely on reliable history. Luke was a physician, and Luke wrote in the 22nd chapter of his book that Jesus' sweat became like great drops of blood. Interestingly, the medical community has a name for this. It's called hematidrosis. There you go. You can school your friends at Scrabble. According to Dr. Timothy Metherell in the book The Case for Easter, which I highly recommend, this is a known medical condition called hematidrosis. It's associated with a high degree of psychological stress, end quote. Jesus knew he's about to be arrested, whipped to within an inch of his life, and carry the sins of all people for all time to the cross and be crucified like a criminal. Jesus capped the night with a agonizing, sin-bearing, hell-fighting, all-night prayer meeting. Then he was scourged, beaten. The Jews had a 39 lashes law, but the Romans weren't so polite. They had no lash limit. Sometimes their victims died at the whipping post before they ever got to the cross. The Roman whipping weapon of choice was the cat of nine tails, a whip with leather braids and metal balls and sharp shards of bone that ripped into Jesus' side and shredded his back into ribbons of flesh and muscle. But Jesus was not beaten for his crimes. He was beaten for our healing, for Isaiah prophesied he would be wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. And the chastisement of our peace would be upon him, and by his stripes we were healed. Dr. Metherell continued, and I quote, "Because of the terrible effects of this beating, there's no question that Jesus was already in serious to critical condition even before the nails were driven through his hands and feet." End quote. When they got to Calvary's crest, the Romans drove 5 to 7 inch long spikes into Jesus' wrists and feet. Then they hoisted him up on the cross for everyone to see. The pain was so unbearable, so barbaric, they coined a new term for it: excruciating. It literally means out of the cross. Think about it. There wasn't a term gruesome enough. We had to make up one because of the pain of the cross. As Jesus hung between heaven and earth, he pushed himself up to take his breaths. And when he pushed up, his exposed back scraped against the rugged timber of the cross as the nail tore further into his foot. Finally, when he just didn't have the strength to push himself up anymore, he died. The soldiers were smart, but they weren't doctors, and they certainly weren't medical examiners. So one soldier in charge of quality control needed to make sure this would-be Messiah was really dead. He pulled his spear close to his own side. Then, with all the precision and power he learned in training, he pierced Jesus' lung and heart until blood and water flowed from his side like water. There was no doubt Jesus Christ was dead. But let's say he wasn't. Let's say the swoon theory could be true. Let's say Jesus just swooned on the cross and resuscitated in the tomb. He was wrapped for burial. He had to wriggle out of 75 pounds of grave clothes and aloes and spices. But let's say he wriggled out of all that. He still had to roll away the massive stone in front of the tomb. But let's say, in his weakened and crucified state, he did roll away the stone. He had to fight off several highly trained, heavily armed guards whose lives depended on Jesus staying in the tomb and grave robbers staying out. But let's just say he fought off the guards and won. He has to convince the doubting dozen, -1, that he was more powerful than hell and death to draw them out of hiding and make them believe he was really risen. That would have been tough for a healthy man in his 30s, but impossible for someone who had been scourged, then crucified, then pierced through the heart 3 days earlier. Scripture records it. History records it. Jesus died on Calvary. But the tomb is empty. So there has to be another theory. There is. This theory is called the wrong address theory. After the soldiers pulled his broken body down from the cross, they gave him to Joseph of Arimathea, who gave him his tomb. Mary Magdalene and some of the other ladies followed the funeral procession to see the tomb where they laid his body. But on Sunday morning, she and a few friends were up with the sun, and they made their way to the garden tomb to anoint his body with spices. They knew they couldn't bring him back from the dead, but maybe they could stave off death's stench just a few more days. But wait a minute. We didn't think this through. Who's going to roll the stone away from the tomb? See, the men who hated Jesus were so paranoid that Jesus' dream team would steal his body when no one was looking. They set a massive stone to seal the tomb and stationed armed guards in front of the tomb to fend off any would-be grave robbers. But when Mary and her friends made it to the tomb, they couldn't believe their bleary eyes. The stone was rolled away and the guards were gone. And Mary walked into the tomb wondering, what happened? Did someone steal his body? Did the guards move his body? Where was Jesus? The wrong address theory suggests he wasn't in that tomb because Mary and her friends were at the wrong tomb. Now, they were hysterical and depressed, and disillusioned, disoriented. They didn't know where they were going or what they were doing, so they ran to the wrong tomb. The tomb was empty because the tomb was never full. That's the wrong address theory. Could it be true? Could the women have just been so disillusioned and disoriented that they went to the wrong tomb? Maybe. But Matthew 27 makes it clear they'd been to that tomb before. But just in case they lost their way on that Sunday morning, all they had to do was look for the tomb with the indomitable Roman seal and the indomitable Roman guard. Not every tomb in the garden was sealed with a Roman seal or guarded by a guard, but Jesus' tomb was. But even if every other tomb was sealed with the same seal and guarded by guards, don't you believe the Jews and Romans would have all been too happy to walk the women to Jesus' tomb, show them his body, and crush Christianity before it began? So, is the wrong address theory the right theory? No, it's not. Last one. This is the oldest theory in the book. Literally, because this theory is actually in the book. It's the stolen body theory. It suggests Jesus' disciples stole Jesus' body. But it's a bold-faced lie, and the soldiers who started this theory knew it. The disciples were not superheroes. Every one of them fled for their lives 3 days earlier. So where did they get the courage and the cunning to face down and defeat a highly trained, heavily armed team of guards guarding the grave? Most of them were better with a net than a sword, but even if they overpowered the soldiers were risking their own lives by admitting the disciples stole Jesus' body. They could have regrouped and run the disciples down, but they didn't. And have you heard that liars make bad martyrs? If the disciples stole Jesus' body and lied to the world that he resurrected, why did all of them willingly give their lives for their faith, since all of them knew their faith was just a lie? Where did they get the courage to come out of hiding and proclaim to thousands in the streets that he is risen if they knew he hasn't risen, knowing that they could end up on a cross just like he did? If the disciples stole Jesus' body, one of them would have talked when the Romans held a sword over his head. The beauty about all these theories is they all point to the same indisputable evidence. Jesus' tomb is empty. They don't dispute the tomb is empty. They just don't believe it's empty because Jesus rose from the dead. But it is, because he has. Here's why the empty tomb is the handrail. If Christ is risen, Christianity is real. If he's not, it's not. If Christ is risen, we have a shot, but if not, we don't. If Christ is risen just as he said, then Christ is coming back just as he said. But if not, he's not. But if Jesus rose like he said, we will too, like he said we would. The resurrection is our handrail. Hold on to the handrail. When the world is falling all over the ice, hold on to this truth. Jesus is risen. And since Jesus is greater than the unrelenting grip of the grave, he is greater than your incurable sickness and your crumbling marriage and your drug addiction and your cash crisis and your job loss and your handicap and your fear. Let's answer our first tough question. Is the resurrection really real? Well, I am tickled 3 shades of pink to say yes. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you for giving me the liberty to change it up a little bit. If you have enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody. If you would like a copy of the original 52-week devotional Simplify, just visit pentecostalpublishing.com and you can order that in print or on Kindle. Next week, I want to help answer another tough question. Is there really only one way to God? With so many religions and so many faiths, is there really just one way to get to God? I look forward to talking about that with you, and always look forward to walking closer with Jesus as we walk through Simplify.